Hello and welcome to Nothing But the Truth. Amartya Sen, Chancellor of Nalanda University, a Nobel Prize winner and a Bharat Ratna, has decided he does not want his name to be considered for a second consecutive term as Chancellor of Nalanda University when his present tenure ends this year in July. As he wrote to the Nalanda board, "It's hard for me not to conclude that the government wants me to cease being the Chancellor of Nalanda University after this July." With me to explain the sequence of events that's brought him to this conclusion, as well as the other serious issues he's raised in his letter to the Nalanda board, is Professor Amartya Sen himself. Professor Sen, let me start with a simple question for the benefit of those who don't know the full story. Why have you decided to withdraw your name for consideration for a second term as Chancellor of Nalanda University?
Well, I think there are two issues, really. One is that a university like Nalanda, with ambition for having high academic standards, is dependent on being not interfered with by the government, whether the administration or the political rulers of the government. And it was clear, it's becoming clear for a while, but certainly became clear in the meeting that we had on January 13th and 14th of the governing body, which as Chancellor was chairing. It began with the statement that the government has decided, we had not been told anything about it before, to reconstitute the entire board. Now the board has representatives from other countries, foreign countries, China, Japan, Thailand, Singapore, and so on. And of course, they would have probably gone for the same countries, but the fact is that this was done without any kind of consultation. And as it happened, it was also in violation of some of the provisions of the Nalanda University Act.
In fact, you refer to this in the letter you sent to the Nalanda board, which was published recently by the Indian Express, and you say in that letter that this decision to reconstitute the board was A, unilateral, B, it took the board completely by surprise, as you pointed out just now, and C, it was done without appreciating either the international character of Nalanda University or the fact that the board is a multi-country board. In other words, Nalanda is not a straightforward, simple Indian university.
Yeah.
The government has to treat it differently.
Yes. Of course, they were going to include foreign countries too, but the present representatives need not be there. And the fact that there was no consultation and this whole thing can happen all of a sudden as a kind of declaration, this is the last meeting of the board, I think that made one feel that we were actually in a very fragile position. Now that is not a reason for leaving as Chancellor.
But this is when it first occurred to you that this is becoming an invidious and difficult position for me.
Yes, and I said that, in fact I talked with my colleagues, including my foreign colleague, saying that as Chancellor I will try to do what I can that this kind of thing doesn't happen.
Let's at this moment pause and establish the key facts of what else happened at that meeting in January, because those other events are what led you to decide you wanted to withdraw your name. Now that meeting was on the 13th, 14th of January, and the board unanimously decided to elect you for a second consecutive term as Chancellor. Am I right in saying that?
Indeed so. And urged me not to say no, because I was beginning to getting a bit disheartened, but my colleague said, look, it is the power of the board to select the next Chancellor.
And this is a board that comprises, as you said a moment ago, people from several Asian countries, including Indian academics and professionals. And as you said, it was a unanimous decision which was firm and enthusiastic. Explain to me, what does that phraseology mean?
Well, I'm just quoting the language that was told to me by the person who chaired in the meeting in my absence, obviously. I had recused myself from that discussion. It was chaired by George Yeo,
the Foreign Minister of Singapore.
Former Foreign Minister of Singapore, and he described that, and he told me, Amartya, you have to take it.
And he said this was firm and enthusiastic.
Yes, that's what he said.
Now, the second thing that happened was that the decision of the board to elect you for a second term as Chancellor was communicated immediately to the visitor, that is to say the President of India, as per the Nalanda University Act for his approval. And at the same time as communicating the decision, the board also informed the visitor of the urgency in the matter. What is the urgency in this matter?
Well, you see, we are in the middle of planning our academic future of the courses. We have started very successfully 2 schools, School of History, School of Ecology and Environment. We're in the process of starting, or thinking about starting, teaching will begin in 2016, a School of Economics, a School of Public Health, and possibly a School of Buddhist Studies.
So a chancellor was necessary without any lapse or gap to ensure work continued.
Yes, and also at the moment I would be in the lame duck position that I can't, I mean, as they say,
right.
that is frightfully good of you to take an interest in the future.
And because you'd be in a lame duck position, that was another reason for urgency.
Yes, indeed. So we communicated that, and that was, and fearing that since the process of minuting takes some time, that particular resolution should be, it's an old English
forwarded
practice.
immediately.
No, it's first affirmed and minuted. You have to have two sets of things. That you take the decision, then you ask for that to be the right minute of what was decided after the language is read out. That was minuted, and that happened on the 14th of January.
Quite right. And in fact, this was communicated to the visitor by Gopal Sabharwal, the Vice-Chancellor of Nalanda, on the 15th of January.
That's right.
Since then, 5 weeks have lapsed, and the visitor, that is to say the president, has given no response. Am I right in saying that the silence, the deafening silence from the visitor, only suggests in your eyes 2 things? Either the visitor himself doesn't approve of your getting a second term, or the government has asked him not to approve.
Yes. Well, I think that would seem to be the conclusion. We didn't get, I mean, we sent it directly to the visitor on the 15th, on the 20th, that went, 20th January, that went to the ministry. Now there has been some statement that
I'll come to the ministry statements in a moment's time.
All right.
I want to still finish.
So that was the question. Now, the board was absolutely convinced, since it is the right of the board to select the chancellor, endorsed by the visitor. I think the board did not consider, at least the foreign members of the board and most of the other members of the board too, did not, despite knowing how bureaucratic India could be, took the view that this is a case in which it would proceed as determined by the Act.
In other words, the board expected that the visitor would automatically approve the board's decision. They didn't for a moment think that there would be a lapse of 5 weeks. They didn't for a moment think their recommendation would be rejected.
Yeah, I think, well, there are two reasons for them. One is that it is normally taken in similar context. Many of our conventions derive from the British Convention to be mainly a fairly straightforward exercise. Secondly, the President has taken great interest in Nalanda. In fact, has also discussed with me the future of Nalanda, how it would go.
Now, in your letter to the board, you clearly suggest that you believe it's not the president who didn't approve of a second term for you, but it's the government that wasn't in favor, because you write, and I'm quoting you, "It's hard for me not to conclude that the government wants me to cease being the Chancellor of Nalanda University after this July." What brought you to that conclusion that it was the government that didn't want you to continue?
Well, it's only a surmise, of course, because we would have expected some communication. We were expecting endorsement from the government. In order to make the process quicker, they had, this is all in my absence because I wasn't present, obviously, at that part of the meeting. It was chaired by Giorgio of Singapore. They put in saying, in case the president finds it impossible to agree, and we had the fear that the government might come down, unlikely event, then they should inform us immediately so that we can decide what to do.
Quite right. In fact, I spoke to the spokesman of the Ministry of External Affairs, which is the nodal ministry which handles anything to do with Nalanda University, and he says that on the 15th of January they received extracts of the minutes sent by Gopal Sabharwal, the Vice-Chancellor, where the lady informed the President that the board had strongly recommended you get a second term as Chancellor, but if the visitor wanted a new Chancellor, they would be prepared to put up 3 names for him to choose one from, but they needed 6 months because they were required to do an international search. And the spokesman says that this letter was received in January, your term ends in July, and there is a clear 6 months between the two, and the fact that this was communicated means that their silence, A, suggests that they were not inclined to change. Secondly, their silence suggests that that delay was working in your favor.
Well, I think what the board expected, of course, I mean, it's not the idea that there were two suggestions is not quite right. What they said, they wanted me to be chancellor for another term. It was considering that in case that proves impossible, and the unwritten script of that was that if the government prevents the president from signing it, then for God's sake let us know. We need 6 months to select, and that would mean by in July, not that far away.
But
so
if they didn't indicate that they wanted another person, and those 6 months periods are now fast finishing, isn't that a clear sign they wanted you to continue even though they hadn't put it in black and white? That's what the spokesman says.
I think that's not right. Because if they want that to continue, all they had to do is to sign that document.
Which they didn't.
They didn't.
In other words, there's a simpler way of saying, and a more direct way of saying we want you to continue, rather than doing it by default and silence.
Yeah,
the second thing the spokesman says, and it's equally important, is that as yet, he says the government hasn't received the approved minutes of the Nalanda board. He says all they've received are draft minutes, which they received on the 13th of February. They were asked to give their comments within 2 weeks. That 2-week period lapses on the 27th of February, which is still 6 days away.
Right.
They say once they send their comments, and once all the other people who are required to send comments send their comments, then the approved minutes will come, and then they will be submitted to the president. In other words, what the spokesman is suggesting is you may have jumped the gun and come to the wrong conclusion.
Yes, okay. So let me say 3 things on it. First of all, I think the spokesman is betraying some ignorance of what it is to minute a particular decision. When a board meets, arrives at a decision, then decides that they're going to reaffirm the decision and take it as minuted, read out the language, and then it's minuted. That particular minute is not an extract. That is the minute of the part of the discussion not chaired by me, since I was recused myself, which was minuted then and there, chaired by Giorgio.
And just for clarity for the audience, this minute was sent on the 15th of January, and therefore to claim that you haven't received the minutes, all you received is draft minutes, is to misunderstand the nature of what they received in 15th January.
I hope it reflects ignorance rather than anything worse than that, because 15th it was sent to the President's office, 20th copies were sent to the ministry saying this is the minute of that part of the meeting chaired by Giorgio.
So the spokesman has got it completely wrong. The spokesman has got it completely wrong.
The rest of the meeting was chaired by me, since I was not personally involved. And those minutes have gone out on the 13th of February. Now, they've got nothing to do with this.
You're saying something very important. I'm underlining it for the audience. In other words, the minutes were sent to the president in 2 sets.
Yes.
The first set, which was received by Rashtrapati Bhavan or the government on the 15th of January, is the minute, and it's a confirmed minute, choosing you and strongly recommending you for a second
Chaired
term.
by Giorgio.
Chaired by Giorgio. The second, which may still be a draft minute, is to do with the rest of the meeting.
Yes.
He's trying to conflate the two together to create the impression formal minutes haven't arrived. He's wrong. Yes. Have I understood that correctly?
Absolutely right.
Let me put this to you. In India, as you know, things happen very slowly.
Yeah.
Delay is inevitable if unfortunate.
Yeah.
If the government were to come to you and say, this delay was unfortunate, we apologize. This delay is not intended as a hint that we don't want you. We'd like you to continue. Please do. Would you change your mind?
Well, there's 3 things here. One is that I think it's most unlikely to happen, given what we already know about the government's position, articulated position even by the minister in conversations with others, that is not their position. So if this becomes the position, then that would be a rethought. Now,
so if this becomes their position, you will rethink?
Well, of course, any proposal that's made, even a suggestion that I go to Mars in a boat, should be considered seriously, but obviously, but I'm not saying what answer I would give. But I have to take into account the fact that this was not the government's evidently first view, but they, for one reason or another, decided to change their mind. That's one. Secondly, since, as we discussed earlier, it began with the issue of academic interference and slighting the board. The chancellorship issue came up much later. In my mind was the extraordinary slight of the board, telling them, this is your last meeting, we're going to all change that, unilaterally by the government.
So you want a change of attitude as well?
Well, change of understanding as to what they can do. You see, there is an amendment, and this is the third point. There is an amendment that moved under the previous government, which was to change that and say that the board, when it's reconstituted, will be done on the advice of the retiring academic board, so that it cannot be done unilaterally. This went to Rajya Sabha. It is on the agenda of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, but that could not come for a vote in the last term of the UPA government, because the BJP did not allow anything other than the vote on account.
If I understand what you're saying, and I'm repeating it for clarity, it's the following. In the unlikely event, as you put it, of the government asking you to carry on and apologizing for the delay, you would be prepared to consider, but you're not giving me what your answer would be. However, your answer would depend upon the government giving you an assurance that interference by the government of the sort that you've seen will cease, that the board will have the autonomy it richly deserves.
And the easiest way of doing it is to pass the amendment, which is already on the floor of the parliament.
Let's take a break at that point. We've established one thing that's very important. You believe that, in fact, as you wrote to the Nalanda board, the visitor did not give approval for your second term because he had been asked by the government to withhold approval. Am I right in that?
Yes.
I am right.
Yeah.
And the second thing we've established is, if the government were to come to you and say, we apologize for the delay, please continue, you would be prepared to consider it, but there is a condition. The government must cease being dismissive of the board, it must respect the board's decisions, it must respect the board's autonomy. Again, am I right?
Absolutely.
Let's then take a break at that point. When I come back, I want to turn to some of the other critical issues you raised in that letter to the Nalanda board. We'll be back in a moment's time. Don't go away. Welcome back to Nothing But the Truth, and an exclusive interview with the outgoing Chancellor of Nalanda University, Professor Amartya Sen. Professor Sen, let's now come to some of the other issues raised by you in your letter to the Nalanda board, which was recently published by the Indian Express. You're deeply concerned about the repeated manner and the repeated number of ways the government has been dismissive of the board. This seems to have begun last year, when in fact the board passed revised statutes unanimously and sent them to the visitor, that is the president, for his approval or rejection. And the government only approved some, not others, thus interfering in the autonomy of the board to do what it thinks is right. Why did you take so much umbrage about that?
Well, you see, the statutes are quite important for our purpose. There were some parts of it dealing with administrative affairs, financial affairs. There was also a part which made this tenure of the Chancellor 5 years rather than 3, which is quite centrally relevant to the present question. But what was really important is the fact that the ministry has taken the view that when it is, the Act says that a decision of the board goes to the President as visitor, it is for the ministry to decide what to place before the President and what not. And to the best of our knowledge, things dealing with the term of the President, of the Chancellor, and some other provisions where those statutes were never placed before the President.
In other words, the ministry was acting as a filter between the board and the visitor.
Yeah, rather than a channel as a filter.
And worse still, the ministry was deciding what would be acceptable to the visitor, what would not. And one of the things you believe that the ministry decided was not acceptable was extending the Chancellor's term from 3 to 5 years.
That's exactly the case. But I mean, you know, I don't want to emphasize that particular one. There were several other things. And there was also drawn in the spirit of that the board counts for something. And it takes decision and it communicates. And it was a kind of a conversation, as it were, with the visitor. We have arrived at these things, and these are the reasons. We have a friendly visitor, we thought, and indeed we do, I think. And you know...
the one thing you didn't accept, and the one thing you didn't expect, is that the ministry would actually take political decisions of its own and interfere, in a sense, in the relationship between the board and the visitor. And this sort of interference, which you mentioned earlier, happened this year in January when they wanted to unilaterally reconstitute the board, but actually it's been happening for quite a while.
Yes, it has been happening quite a while. And, you know, I was surprised. I can't say I was totally astonished, because the kind of guardianship attitude that the ministry has tended to take in board meeting, it indicated that there was a kind of confusion that if the government of India is the main financier of an institution, the autonomy of that institution doesn't matter. Now, it's like I worked for London School of Economics, Oxford and Cambridge. Most of these have been run for centuries on governmental money, but that doesn't make them servants of the government.
Quite right. And in fact, this leads you to a third point that you made in your letter to the Nalanda board, and it's probably best expressed in your own language. You write, "I'm also sad that academic governance in India remains so deeply vulnerable to the opinions of the ruling government when it chooses to make political use of the special provisions." And then you add, "The government can turn an academic issue into a matter of political dispensation if it feels unrestrained about interfering." And these examples of selectively approving certain revised statutes and not approving others, or of the government wanting to unilaterally reconstitute the board, are clear examples of the government choosing to make political use of special provisions and thus interfering in academic autonomy.
I agree, absolutely. You know, I think the interesting thing is Britain has two models. The British themselves have been very jealous in guarding academic freedom. So the paymaster, namely the government, is not going to tell how to run Cambridge or Oxford or LSE or Imperial College. If the British in British India, as the colonial masters, kept provisions which are formally much the same, but they could actually exercise it to stop this. Who doesn't know whether there would be nationalism or revolution breeding in Calcutta University or Bombay.
And what this government is doing is to exercise something they are not actually meant to exercise. It's simply there's a formal provision.
They are actually following the British Indian model, the colonial model, rather than the British academic model, which they do for the citizens of their country.
I have time, Professor Sen, for just one question. I know you don't want to talk about Narendra Modi, but I'm going to ask you one question for one reason. You're a proud Indian who's never given up his passport even though he's lived most of his life abroad, and tens of millions look to you for guidance. After what you've been through, what's your assessment of the Modi government and Mr. Modi's Prime Minister over the last 9 months?
I have to talk about the Modi government rather than Mr. Modi as Prime Minister, because I don't know whether Mr. Modi was involved. I was told by some that he was, but I have no hard evidence on that at all. So I can't really, as an empirical scientist, talk about that. As far as the Modi government is concerned, its inclination to interfere in matters which are really not formally matters of governmental decision, turning an academic decision in this case into a political one, has been very strong. So in judging that, I would certainly have to say that I'm disappointed. On the other hand, if I were to discuss the Modi government's performance, as an economist, that would not be would be the only thing I'd be concerned with. I'd be concerned with whether it pays enough attention to the poor, or whether it's governed much more by the interest of the rich. This has nothing to do with liberalization and reform, which we do need.
Are you also worried about the minorities?
Oh, I'm very worried about the minorities. And, you know, if I could take statements, acts of speech, to be a total guarantee would be one thing. But, you know, we have had very good statements from Modi, which I applaud, about the dangers of women at night, lack of toilets, undernourishment, without much action. So that the fact that there had been a very good statement by Modi, which I appreciate very much, is fantastic, but at the same time...
It's insufficient.
It's insufficient.
In other words, he needs to act, not just talk.
That is indeed the case.
In a word, Prime Minister Modi, as far as you're personally concerned, is still under test.
Well, I didn't want to make this statement on Prime Minister Modi. I think, as I understand, by reading what the government is doing, I would say that is true of the government's record.
Professor Sen, a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much.